Today I am bringing you a list of my top 10 favourite sci-fi books. This is a video that I've never made on my channel. I really want to read more science fiction in 2026, and I think a good place to start is to actually look at the books that I've already read and loved. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. I've broken down this list into various subgenres. Putting together this list made me realise that I've read a lot of dystopian fiction. I've read a lot of speculative literary fiction. I would still consider that sci-fi though. I haven't read as many space operas, so if you do have recommendations specifically for space operas, then please let me know. But the subgenre that we're going to start with is actually sci-fi thrillers, because I've read quite a few of those as well. First on my list we have Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This is a difficult book to explain, but the way that I would pitch it is we're following a main character who wakes up in a facility after being kidnapped, and he is being told that the life that he remembers is not actually true. It's very mind-bendy, but the essence of the story is that we're following this guy as he's trying to get back to his wife and son. It's extremely fast-paced, very action-packed, not my usual style of book. However, I think it worked for me in this because I really liked the themes in this. The main character spends a lot of time reflecting on his life and thinking about what could have been, and I really liked that element. I also really liked the ending. It's interesting because I was speaking to my partner about this. He has also read this book. I remember talking to him at the time and he said that he didn't like the ending, whereas the ending was what made this 5 stars for me. It was very twisty, lots of different turns, and I just had so much fun with this, even though it kind of gave me a headache from how mind-bendy it was. Next up we have The One by John Mars. This is set in the not so distant future where a company have found out a way of matching soulmates based on DNA. So imagine you can send off a cheek swab and you'll get an email saying, hey, you have a match, we found the person that is perfect for you, but only if they have also paid to send off their DNA. It's completely changed the way that people approach relationships, because there's some people who are absolutely against this concept. They do not like this idea at all, but then there's other people who maybe they like the idea of having someone tell them who they're compatible with. This follows multiple perspectives of people who have just received that email telling them that their match has been found, and it is extremely fast-paced. The chapters are very short, and I am not exaggerating when I say that there is a cliffhanger at the end of pretty much every chapter. Whatever your experience with reading thrillers, this feels so unique and so unexpected. One thing I think is important to know is that John Mars writes 2 different types of thrillers. He writes the sci-fi speculative thrillers, and then he also writes standard domestic thrillers. I don't love his domestic thrillers, but I will read anything that he writes set within this world. Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I wasn't sure whether to consider a sci-fi thriller, but to me it feels the most comfortable in this subgenre. This, if you don't know, follows a guy who wakes up in space alone with no memory of how he got there or why he's there. Slowly, as his memory comes back, he realises that maybe he has a mission to complete and maybe the world is at stake. It does have that survival type plot, which is why I think it does give you that thriller feeling. There's a lot of heavy science, but it feels really accessible. There's never a point where I'm confused or where I'm struggling to follow it. It all seems to make sense and it all seems plausible, even though I'm not an expert and maybe it's all complete rubbish, but it doesn't feel like that. I do like stories like this where you're following a character and you're inside their mind and you're seeing them having to motivate themselves when they're alone and they're isolated, how they're creating their own entertainment but also trying to pull themselves through the hard moments. I thought the characters in this were fantastic. This also has a lot of heart, and I think for that reason that's why for me personally I preferred it to The Martian. I still gave The Martian 5 stars, and that if I was doing a top 20 list, The Martian would be on this list, but Project Hail Mary just hit differently. Very excited for the movie adaptation, although if you are interested in reading the book, I would recommend not watching the trailer for the movie because I feel like it spoils an important element, which I actually knew about this element before I picked up the book, but I think you might have a more surprising time if you went into this not knowing more than the basics. Moving on to some more speculative fiction / dystopian fiction, and first up we have The Measure by Nikki Erlich. This is one of my favourite books of all time. I read it a couple of years ago and I still think about it on a regular basis because of how much of an impact it had on me. The concept behind this is that everyone on Earth wakes up one morning to find a box either next to them or outside their front door. On this box it says, "This is the measure of your life." It turns out that each box has a piece of string, and the string tells you how long you're going to live for. It's not really about the boxes and why these boxes have appeared. So if you go into this expecting a mystery, then I think you're going to be really disappointed. This is more about the ramifications, how people are forced to make a decision. Do they open their boxes? Do they not? People react not only to their own situations, but to other people's situations. It talks about othering, how short stringers, as they're called, start to experience discrimination. It also talks a lot about the political and societal changes, and it was that aspect that I really loved. I love it when an author takes a concept and they really run with it. They go into so much detail and they think about things that I hadn't even thought about. It really hit me on a personal level because some of these characters find out that they do have short strings, and as someone who has been through a life-threatening illness, it brought up a lot of feelings and it kind of validated them, which is why it's one of my favourite books of all time. What's interesting about this next book is that it's dystopian fiction that was written in the 1990s, but it's set in the 2020s, and that is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. It's written like a diary, so we're following a teenage girl who lives in one of the last safe communities in California. Climate change has meant that water is now super expensive, the police are corrupt, and vigilantes walk the streets. So it's very dangerous outside of this community. She listens to the adults in her life talking about how if they just continue the way that they are, things will eventually go back to how they used to be. However, she disagrees. She thinks that they should be making plans for the future, and she starts to form this religion and makes plans to go out and spread the word about this religion. I think if you enjoy TV shows like The Walking Dead and The Last of Us, not because of the zombies or anything like that, but because of what they have to say about humanity and how humanity changes and adapts because of extreme events, then I think this could really work for you. It's really unsettling reading this now, thinking about how much Octavia Butler was able to predict. Scythe by Neil Shusterman is the only YA book that I have on my list. However, don't let that put you off. I still feel like there's a lot that adults can get from this story. It's not technically a dystopian because it's set in a utopian society where humans have been able to eradicate death. People no longer die from natural causes. Instead, you have this organisation called the Scythes, and they are responsible for keeping the population down. It follows two teenagers who are training to become Scythes, and they come across different people who have different ways of meeting their quotas. It talks a lot about morality, and I really appreciated that. Like I said, I think that there's a lot that you can get from this book. It's been a while since I read it. I think I read it about 4 or 5 years ago, and I still think about it quite often. I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman is translated fiction. It was originally published in French. I would consider this dystopian fiction, even though you could argue it's more literary fiction. It's speculative, and so I would still say that it counts. It follows a group of women who are being kept in a bunker underground. They are being guarded by men who have guns, and they have no idea what they're doing there. The main character that we're following is the youngest out of these women. She is a teenager. She's not quite sure exactly how old she is, but all the other women are older, and they do vaguely remember a time before this bunker. That does cause some conflict and some differences because she doesn't remember anything other than this experience of being in this bunker. I got to a certain point where something happened, and I thought, okay, well, now I need to keep on reading to find out what's going to happen next. Got to another point, something else happened, and next thing I knew, I'd read the book in one sitting. I think this was so compelling because there was so much mystery, but also I feel like that's misleading because I don't think this is a book that gives you all the answers. Instead, it expects you to come up with your own theories, and I really loved that. I think this would be a fantastic book to read as part of a book club or to read and discuss with other people because there is so much that you can dissect. It feels like such a simple concept, but from where it starts to where it ends, there is so much in between, and I loved that. Compound by Aisling Rawle is another book that I read towards the end of last year, and this was one of my favourite books of last year. It also won the Goodreads Choice Award in the sci-fi category. The marketing for this describes it as Lord of the Flies meets Love Island, and I do think that that's accurate. However, I think some people hear Love Island, they hear reality TV and assume that this is going to be kind of lighthearted and trashy, and that was not my experience. I think this is a very fascinating character study. We're following a group of people who are living in this compound in the desert where they are on a reality TV show. They're competing for prizes individually and as a group, but it still feels like a survival story because it's very clear from the clues that you get that something is a little bit off. This world is set kind of in the future, and they talk about wars that have happened. It seems like the climate has changed because it's incredibly hot and, you know, they're in the desert. The people in this group start to take on different roles. For example, there are people who are natural leaders, whereas the main character that you're following is not a leader. She openly says that she's quite vapid and she doesn't feel like she really has much to offer to this group. She's very much driven by consumerism, and I thought that was a really interesting discussion. I think if you go into this with the right expectations, then you could really enjoy this. I really loved the audiobook as well, by the way. I listened to this one on audio and I was completely captivated. There were some parts where my heart was in my stomach and I felt so tense, but it's not really a thriller. Lord of the Flies is actually one of my favourite classics, even though I read it like 20 years ago, and so anything that has that kind of vibe tends to really work for me. If you only take one recommendation from this video, then let it be The Wayfarers series by Becky Chambers, the first book being The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I'm holding this one up because it's the only book that I own physically, but technically books 2 and 3 were my favourites. I would still recommend reading the series in order. Each book wraps up with its own self-contained plot, but I think the first book does a very good job of grounding you in this setting. The way that I like to pitch this series is that it's set way, way, way in the future where humans have left the Earth, gone out into the galaxy and become a part of the galactic community. One of the main characters in this book is called Rosemary, and she joins a ship that travels quite a lot through space because their job is to punch holes through the galaxy to make for better transport links. Rosemary is brought on to help them communicate with other species on the planets that they travel through, and it talks a lot about the importance of communication, the importance of understanding other people's cultures, and I just thought it was so beautifully done. It's so heartwarming. There were times throughout this series where I cried just because I was feeling so overwhelmed. Love Becky Chambers' writing. There's just something so comforting about it. Even if you don't read a lot of sci-fi, then I think you could really enjoy this. I think this would be a good place to start if you don't read a lot of sci-fi, or even if you do and you just want something that feels a bit cozier. Give this one a go because I loved it so much. Every single book in the series was 5 stars. The final book that I have to talk about is Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. This is a sci-fi romance, and I think it is very important to know that it is equal parts a romance as well as being sci-fi. If you go into this just for the romance, then I think you might find the political side of the plot a little bit boring. This also kind of has a mystery thriller plot because essentially the way that this solar system is structured, or the way that it maintains peace, is through marriage contracts. It's a male-male romance between 2 key figures. So one is a diplomat and one is a prince, and basically this arranged marriage happens because the diplomat was previously married to the prince's cousin, but this cousin has died. So the government starts to panic because they need to keep this marriage contract going. It felt like the relationship was developed in a way that felt very natural. They weren't the best at communicating at times, but it felt believable rather than frustrating. This is a story about healing after being in an abusive relationship, so do bear that in mind. But I thought that both characters were very strong. They had equally interesting characteristics, personalities, even though they were the complete opposites of one another. One is very outgoing and doesn't really pay much attention to politics. He's a bit of a party prince, whereas the other is much more introverted because he's been trained his whole life for the role that he's been placed in. I love politics in fantasy and sci-fi, and I also love a slow burn romance, so I think that's why this was perfect for me. That does bring us to the end of this video, so thank you for watching. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments any of your favourite sci-fi books, and if you've read any of the books that I've talked about in this video. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye!